Well, it's finally come to it. The last chapter of Book 2. It's kind of funny how we got all this way here in the first place, ain't it? In this chapter, it's going to be debuting one of our newer voice actresses. Y'all going to hear her in a bit. But, yeah, so when this is all done, it's going to go through the stages of Book 1 did and be published as an actual book. And hopefully, that goes well. It was a process last time. But anyway, before we get into the chapter, be sure to stop by our affiliates, Redcon 1, for all your protein and gym and dietary supplement needs so you can get big and strong just like me and toss cows over your shoulder if you so wish to, and or water heaters out your front door. Also stop by Skull Splitter Dice for any dice sets you may need for your click-clack goblin math rock needs. They have lots of sets, so be sure to scroll through the web pages and see if you need anything. Then also stop by Wargaming Delivered for all the paint needs you may have or miniature needs for brushes, paints, mixing balls, terrain, flock, whatever you need, they have it if it's in stock. Chapter 13. Waiting for the other shoe. The city of Tallwheat bowed under the weight of what happened to it, what had happened within it. Every district had been affected in some way by the running gunfights within its streets, with the Square and Market district having been hit the hardest. While some buildings and homes only had to fill in bullet holes or sweep up piles of spent brass from their floors, others found their homes or businesses nothing but piles of rubble due to the explosions from weapons or magical detonations. This, of course, was the smallest of the problems. The largest problem was the sheer amount of dead and wounded that needed to be cleared away from the city and the approach to the trench. The number of bodies gathered and counted just from the trench line and the approach to the trench from the portal numbered in the thousands and were unmanageable in terms of just figuring out what to do with them all. This duty fell to Yule, and he was almost mentally crushed under the weight of this task and his ever-mounting paranoia. Flies and stench were the first hurdle to overcome, as there were few within Tallwheat who could handle the smell of rotting corpses. But thankfully there were those in the 2nd Division that knew a thing or two about frost and winter spells. With their help, older or more mangled bodies were frozen solid, allowing them to be moved and buried quickly. Yule personally spearheaded this task, and stuck himself in with the rest of the body movers. And the only reason he still held on to reality and didn't succumb to his demons was the ever-watchful eye of Olivara constantly keeping him in check. At times she could be seen holding Yule by the arm and slowly running her fingers through his hair while speaking closely to his ear. She had even called in help from Chickly, who kept Yule busy by constantly pestering him and riding around on his shoulders. Chickly had found the combat within the city quite enjoyable, having been busily dropping grenade clusters from the air with other harpies or running medical supplies back and forth from the rear. There still was of course the issue with the rest of the fresher bodies once the older ones had been cleared away, and Yule drummed up volunteers from both the local citizens of Tallwheat, his own forces, as well as the chosen children prisoners. Even as these groups moved bodies into rows and counted, more wounded would be found hiding amongst the bodies, or even healthy soldiers who had been pretending to be dead after being left behind. This led to, at times, anxious standoffs as they thought they were about to be executed. But most of the time it was resolved peacefully, the remnants of the enemy force being taken prisoner and led back to the city. This task alone took 2 days to complete, and on the last day Yule was sitting on top of a burned out stoog, a steel cup of tea in his hands. He watched Chickly roughhouse and play with some other harpies in the air above him, simply enjoying the sounds of something other than gunfire and screaming. First Sergeant Erinda Caine made her way over towards him, her sleeves rolled up to expose her scratched up and bandaged dark yellow arm muscles, and she had gotten a cut across her forehead from stone shrapnel after taking cover from a tank round.
Yule?
She said with a nod, and leaned against a stoog just below Yule, her rifle rattling on her shoulder against her prayer beads. First Sergeant Caine. Yule murmured back, and he rubbed a thumb up and down the side of his hot steel cup.
You're looking better.
She lied, and looked up at Yule without moving her head. In her opinion, she thought he looked like shit, but didn't think such brutal honesty would be a good idea at this point.
Eldehinda taking care of you, I take it.
And Yethis. She keeps making me drink this tea. Says it's good for my blood or something. Yule replied, bringing the tea up to his lips to take a pull from it. Erinda Caine could smell what the tea was and knew that Yethis was lying as well. Archer bark tea was used to keep people from going insane, as it helped level out their mood and suppress feelings of anger or fear. It was a favorite of the White Feather Knolls, as it got you higher than the moon if it was strong enough. Erinda Caine nodded.
I see. That's good tea. Be sure you drink all of it or else it doesn't work.
Yule hummed in his throat as a reply and brought the cup back up to his lips. Erinda Caine looked out into the field.
Thinking of just burying them out here?
Going to have to, at least with the trench, anyway. Yule said after clearing his throat, and he placed the cup down onto his knee, a few idle fingers laced through the handle. Everyone else may as well bury them here with those they died beside.
How many?
Erinda asked. Yule was silent as he gazed out into the open field, in which task teams moved bodies into neat rows while writing down names. He rubbed his thumb along the top of his cup before picking it back up again, pausing just before his mouth. Last count, 12,000 confirmed here before the trench, a few hundred within the city. Erinda Caine blew a breath out through her lips.
That's a fair chunk for just one battle, I have to say. Probably sought to eradicate you.
Still not sure how they didn't, Yule said dourly, but couldn't elaborate any further before Erinda Caine spoke up again.
What about the 2nd Division?
She asked, and she rummaged around in her pocket, pulling out what looked like a candy bar to Yule. Is that a Milky Way? Where the hell did you get a Milky Way? He said with actual confusion on his face.
Oh, you know. Was searching the pockets of a dead southern elf and came across it. Was trying to find some ammunition but decided to tuck it in my pocket just in case it was important. Domino said it was some kind of snack.
Yule Burt stared, as per the popular puppet beloved by older humans, down at her as she took a bite of the bar and pulled it away from her teeth. She giggled at how the caramel stretched, despite herself or the situation, and quickly wiggled the strings of caramel and nougat back into her mouth. As she chewed with a smile, Yule looked up to Chickley's call and saw the Harpy was making his way back towards town. Anyway, 2nd Division came out on top with only 1,000 and change killed in action. However, we are drowning in our wounded. I think the last count from Gruesome was over 6,000 wounded in one way or another, maybe half of which were critical. Erinda Caine nodded as she took another bite of the Milky Way, chewing for a moment before tucking it into her cheek to speak.
Think we made an impression?
Yule turned his head and sadly rested his gaze onto the field of dead before him, pulling his steel cup to his lips and draining it down to the dregs. He flicked the remnants of his cup out onto the grass and slipped over the side of the burned-out Stug. As he walked out towards the trench line, Erinda Caine kept pace, chewing her way through her Milky Way as Yule spoke. Yeah, I think we made an impression. The largest part of the task came as the bodies began to be buried one by one out in the field, or in mass as the trench was filled in and covered with soil. This was made easier and faster by magic users who were skilled in moving earth, and they were able to scoop out deep sections of ground and piles so those around them could place a body down inside of it, then using shovels to cover it up. Before the sun was down, every body had found a place to rest within the ground. The siege golems that lay about the ground were moved as well using larger vehicles, and were slowly positioned so that their large blocky hands were resting on their chests, feet together, and carved faces looking up towards the sky. Yule knew it wasn't really needed or even necessary to waste time doing this, but he felt that these magical automatons deserved to lay in poses of resting, not face down and splayed along the ground in the manners of which they died. There was only one exception to this rule, and that was the golem that had died curling around a pocket of wounded to keep them safe. Those who had died under its care were buried within the shelter it had created for them, and Yule saw it fit to leave it just as it had died, curled around those it had tried to protect. Yule was emotionally spent as he sat alone on a bench at the edge of the city, the sun crawling down towards the horizon in the distance. Somewhere deep inside of him, he quietly wished there was a sniper hiding in the bushes with a crosshair trained on his forehead, but at the same time he felt that the goddess who currently resided within him would simply drag him back out. Behind him, the city of Tallwheat still rang and reverberated with the sounds of repairs being made to damaged structures, or straight up rebuilding them from the foundation. He sat and listened to it for a time before hearing steps coming down the road behind him, and he straightened up, feeling Cringia curl warily inside of him.
Sitting here, all alone?
Rommel said before coming to a stop beside the bench, her arms slowly folding across her chest as she looked at you with her bright eyes. People are allowed to sit alone, Faye. Yule replied in a low tone, and turned to see that Rommel was happily wearing an entire Veil Rider Auxiliary Field uniform, all the way down to the shiny black boots. Of course, she also still wore her scarf, which was neatly tucked into the uniform top. Rommel stepped around the side of the bench and sighed as she sat down next to Yule, making sure to spread her knees enough to smack the side of Yule's leg with her own. Yule looked down at Rommel and puffed the air of a laugh out his nose. You were a man for so long you can't even sit like a woman.
Would you like me to also wear a dress and simper at you?
Rommel said with a toothy grin, and Yule actually laughed aloud softly at this. You? No. Rommel snorted happily in laughter, wiggling her leg back and forth to continuously bap the side of Yule's thigh with her knee. They sat in silence for a few minutes, staring out at the now cleaned and mound-covered trench line, until Rommel looked up at Yule, her arms still crossed over her chest.
You should have lost.
I know. Yule said quietly, and his head drooped a few inches. I know. They had me dead to rights, and I know that. Even the air support wouldn't have done anything much except annoy them until it was shot out of the sky. Yule began to tap the pad of his finger against the opposite hand's finger pads as he counted. They had more armor, more advanced armor, more bodies, more modern tech on their infantry. They would have been bogged down in the city for a while, for sure, but they would have pushed in on my flanks and forced me to call for a general retreat.
Yet, they did not.
Rommel mused, and she wiggled the heels of her boots back and forth on the ground.
To be fair, I knew you were going to lose. I was curious to see how you handled such a defeat. It was written on the stones of which all military leaders observe. Yes, you would have made them pay a large sum to obtain a victory, but the victory was theirs all the same, just as I knew we were going to lose the war in Germany.
Yule leaned forward, resting his elbows on his thighs as he steepled his hands over his nose, rubbing them back and forth along his face as he thought. Rommel, however, continued her train of thought.
There are only two things that can turn the tide of a battle like this. One of them being the timely arrival of overwhelming reinforcement, which, of course, we both know you did not have happen.
And the other? Yule said, voice hollow as it echoed out of his hands.
Treachery.
Rommel stated matter-of-factly, and Yule slowly turned his head up and away from his hands. Rommel looked over at him for a response, but when none came, she plowed ahead, resetting her crossed arms.
You had an entire flank free from combat, and able to swing in to crush against their center. This, of course, was never part of your enemy's battle plan, I'm sure. Someone was supposed to keep that flank busy, or crush right through into your center. But that party never arrived. Don't you think it's odd?
Yule leaned up fully now and was looking sideways at Rommel with knit-together brows. To be quite honest, I thought it was some kind of trick to draw me out again, and suspected they had artillery waiting. Are you implying someone on the enemy command intentionally left my flank open? Rommel shrugged.
That's the only thing that makes sense to me. I already knew you put that Prince Nim out on the other flank, with most of your armor in the notion the king would try to keep his son alive. That in return meant the enemy would have crushed harder into your center and opposite flank with those three resources.
Why the hell would they leave my flank open though? They had me here. They could have decimated my 2nd Division and pushed me back down the road. Plus it would have been a big public relations boost for them. Where does an entire flank attack go? At these words, Rommel grinned again, teeth bright with the last remnants of the setting sun.
About 10 miles off course.
And how would you know that? Yule asked, leaning in slightly towards Rommel with a raised brow. Rommel pulled a hand free from her crossed arms and gestured with it airily.
Oh, just may have been spying on those 2 lovebirds that run your communications. You wouldn't believe the kind of things they get up to in that truck. I once heard the gremlin woman tell Fino to put her feet on.
Let's stick with the whole enemy unit off-course thing, Rommel, Yule said, cutting in and holding a bladed hand in front of his face as it contorted in disgust. Rommel blew a short raspberry out of her lips.
Fine, but I swear, Gremlin is in a race to be the first pregnant human. There are times they do it
She turned, holding up 5 fingers, but saw the dagger-like expression of Yule greeting her.
Why? Well, one of her robotic planes saw an entire attack force miles away from Captain Fadida's flank. I poked my head in to see just how far away, and it seemed quite deliberate.
Yule inhaled through his nose slowly as he turned away from Rommel and looked out over towards the flank he knew was under the charge of the Queen's 13th. So you're saying someone deliberately gave that flank attack bad coordinates and put them miles away on purpose? Rommel nodded and shrugged a shoulder as she continued to wiggle her boots on their heels.
It is the only thing that makes sense to me. Clearly someone on the other side wanted you to win.
Do you think it was a human? They were all over the place during this fight, and even a few of them were captured alive. They're not talking, but one of the more senior warcasters says he can smell magic on them, but isn't sure what it is.
If they signed a contract of some kind, they could be doing it. Contract magic is tricky and fiddly to get right, but if you do get it right, it can hold power even over other greater fae. For all we know, they can't talk because it would break an agreement with the main body of it.
Rommel tucked her boots, then rocked forward, coming up onto her feet.
There are ways to get around it, like tapping fingers for answers and all that. Just be sure to give them options. There's always a loophole in Fae logic.
Yule chewed on the inside of his lip for a moment before deciding to stand up as well, turning to look at Rommel as she bent down to fix the lacing on one of her boots. What is your real plan here, Romella? You're not here to just hang out and talk shop.
Using my Fae name. Now I must be in real trouble.
Rommel said with a dry laugh as she stood back up and placed a hand in the pocket of her uniform bottoms. She looked out to the dimming sky, the sun having dipped below the horizon, and the 2 of them stood in silence as she smiled sadly to the oncoming night. When she spoke, her German accent became thicker and her words were soft.
For so long, I did my job like a good little Fae. But I think I like the fear of being a rogue too much to go back. I think I try and find other Dracanics who have been poisoned by you stinky little humans, like I was. See if they want to forge ahead on our own path, just like you.
Rommel turned and flashed her teeth at Yule in a sardonic smile, then turned on her heel smartly, arms going from her pockets to an idle rest behind her back. As she walked back towards the city proper, she called back out to him, not turning her head or body as she continued on her way.
Also, Alavara figured you were here. She asked me to bring you home. I'm sure a big, strong boy like yourself can find your way.
Yule did eventually find his way back into the waiting arms of Alavara, who set to scolding him for walking out without anybody with him in such a mental state. He would never admit it, of course, but Alavara did make him feel better with her constant fussing. She went as far as to clean her newly reissued Daewoo rifle with him in order to make sure he wasn't alone, as even now Yule still radiated fear and anxiety about the victory that was never his to begin with. Nighttime was especially taxing for Alavara, as she stayed up for hours on end to pry and pluck away his fears with her mental tendrils, just to make sure he got a good night's sleep and could function the next day. The battle was over in Tallwheat, and the forces of King Radagim had withdrawn fully, trailing back to their holdings in Redtur, Raktur, and Parlum. Tallwheat was able to finally breathe, as was Prince Nim, who after burying the brother slain by his hand, set to upgrading and fortifying his city with the ever-enthusiastic help of the Veil Riders and their engineers. The prince was so busy that he rarely had time to pester Yule, something the human didn't mind whatsoever. The time that could have been spent constantly answering questions from Prince Nim was instead put to good use with Olivara, the two spending many mornings sleeping in past the rising sun's call and walking together through the repaired streets of Tallwheat. Tallwheat had recovered well from its battering, and while it would not be completely the same, the citizens who called it home bounced back eagerly with their newfound independence. Much like New Sanrion, the now independent denizens of Tallwheat held proud the new decrees of their prince, which were modeled after the declarations of governors under the influence of the Veil Riders. Those of able body were required to own their very own issued firearm and practice with it in their spare time, something that they took to with gusto in the impromptu training range that was quickly becoming a town meeting area to gossip and make trade deals. The younger citizens of Tallwheat that found they enjoyed the flavor of war were rolled into the new 99th Tallwheat, a company comprised of only volunteers from the city. Their NCOs were picked from the royal guard that protected Prince Nim, and the fighting force became the first to pioneer the autoglaive. The dwarves and humans had a field day with this weapon, combining the blade and length of a glaive with the firing mechanisms of the standard issue Daewoo K2. Yule thought the weapon was an abomination, but everyone else seemed to think it a grand idea. The weapon itself was usable as both rifle and melee weapon, the butt of which could comfortably rest on the shoulder to be fired while standing, but excelled at being used prone or rested upon another surface. Yule made his opinion known to Prince Nim, who had been given command of the 99th, but unfortunately the prince shared the same enthusiasm as Yule's human Veil Riders, some of whom had taken models of the weapon as their own as they rolled out of Tallwheat's newly made gunsmithing guilds. Yule did, however, put his foot down, ordering that members of the 2nd Division were to only use their standard issue equipment, and that the autoglaive was extremely niche in its use. That did not, however, stop many within the 2nd Division buying the weapon with their own pay, and keeping them in their own equipment stores just in case. Days trailed into weeks as the city rebounded and regrew, all the while reinforcements slowly trickled in via the roads from Valhalla Hill. The most important addition to these reinforcements came 3 weeks after the retreat of the enemy's forces, and that was the new upgraded armor that began to arrive via truck. The dwarves, seeing the faults in the Stug 4 platform despite their additions, switched their fire over to what they saw as a far better model that could still be mass-produced in the same fashion. The Delta Juliet-93 Abrams Hunter Jagdpanther was, to the dwarves, their crowning achievement in modernizing a human classic. They were still unable to make stable hydraulics and other machinery needed for the more complicated turreted main battle tanks, and were in the mind that casemates were far superior in terms of engagements over open ground and in ambush conditions, as well as being simply faster overall to produce, and thus they would keep their turreted vehicles purely in the scout car variety. The Delta Juliet-93 Jagdpanther was a smooth blend of modern human armor and antiquated design, as the front plate was devoid of any ports at which the highly accurate Abrams could punch around through. The front plate was smooth and well angled all the way up to the top armor plate, at which a heavily armored commander viewport was installed. On the other side was a driver's periscope that jutted just out of the plate, above which was a hatch that the driver could enter and exit into their position. The interior was spacious and comfortable, a design flaw well learned from the Stug 4, and while it still sported a 5-person crew, it was spacious enough to avoid the entire crew getting slagged by a single round. The gun had also been upgraded, as the dwarves recognized that the Abrams tank needed to be destroyed as quickly as possible. And now these new vehicles sported a smooth-bore 130mm Abram Thagandi, or Abram Breaker. Not only was the gun upgraded, but as was the suspension system and tracks, borrowed from the long-ago captured Paladin artillery platform, and the targeting systems. These targeting systems used the same gremlins as the dwarves had been using in most of their modernized equipment, and while they were still moody, these gremlins seemed to have some kind of pride in being in such a vehicle. These gremlins were able to calculate ranges and run secondary systems without the aid of its crew, as well as feed back rusting information on far more crude digital readouts. Joined to the gun was a coaxial 40mm grenade launcher that was fed via a belt system, while on top was a remotely operated M240 Bravo near the loader hatch and an MG3 on a pintle near the commander's hatch. When the first Delta Juliet-93 rolled its engine over, Yule couldn't help but whistle at the sleek machine as it slid off the trailer and trundled up next to the truck that had carried it. Fockett knew what he liked, that was for sure, as the dwarf had made sure to have them painted in a nice dark green color that would match well with their uniforms. An engineer saw Yule and waved, her long sideburns braided and inwoven with what appeared to be silver wire.
Mr. Yule?
That's me, Yule said, and walked over to her as 5 more Delta Juliet-93s began to exit their trailers. The dwarfess rifled through her papers on her clipboard before finding the one she needed, and she handed the paper to Yule with a glittering smile. Yule flicked the paper and looked down at it, eyes narrowing as he traced down the page. These are expensive. And there are how many more coming?
Fockett says to expect at least 2 more sets. There would be more, but we ran into some issues with their mithril weavers, as their machines ran afoul of some old bearings giving way, and they take time to replace.
I don't know if I can afford 2 more sets, ma'am, Yule said, and looked over at the new machine with almost an air of sadness.
Fockett says he knows you have something he wants.
The dwarfess said with a sly wink, and Yule hung his head as he laughed quietly. Really? He made these expensive on purpose, didn't he? The dwarfess coolly picked at her sleeve cuff as she pursed her lips.
You have been keeping quite a tight grip on that cooling technology after all.
You're going to put these in front of me, with inflated prices, just to gouge the ability to keep your drinks cool? Really? Yule said with a flat look, and the dwarfess actually shrugged, holding her hands in the air as she looked up.
Hey, it's none of my business. If you want to pay the gold, you can. Or you can hand over those blueprints, and you'll be swimming in all the vehicles you need.
She held her pose, but flicked her eyes at Yule, and Yule closed his, running his middle finger down the bridge of his nose. Go and speak with Gremlin. She'll get you sorted out. Yule sighed unhappily, but didn't even have a second to live with the annoyance before she flicked up a second page.
And I have a letter from Thane Stefner.
Yule groaned with an open mouth and let his arms fall to his sides. Not her, too.
She has a proposition.
The dwarfess said coolly, but did not hand over the paper. Instead, she turned Yule away from the crowds of troopers so their backs were to the open air, and she held up the letter on her clipboard so just the 2 of them could see.
She says you can have them done sooner if you are willing to, how do you humans say it? Play ball.
Yule narrowed his eyes at the letter as he read, and he worked his jaw slowly in a circle as he took in the words. That is going to cause a major escalation of force. Do you guys even understand what I mean by that? The dwarfess nodded and shifted the letter to expose another underneath.
We do. We have plans set with the elves of Regensen and are working in tandem.
And I know you need those schematics in order to make them fully capable, but they hold more than just destructive power. Those chips are extremely valuable, even Fockett knows that, and I'm not going to part with them for chump change.
We know,
She said, and moved the 2 letters aside to expose an agreement underneath as well.
we figured production numbers as well as a promised lump sum per month could whet your thoughts. This will be for time to your heirs, as well as the heirs of those who would also assist us.
You're asking a whole lot. I'm sure you even know that I have to give you additional plans and know-how in order to make these and other materials work, Yule said, dropping his voice and using more vague terms as the pair stepped backwards away from more troopers who had come in from the city. Yule tapped at several items on the sheet as he did this. Being able to give you the ability to see at night even, you understand, I'm sure.
We do understand, Mr. Yule, just as we understand you need money. This little agreement will have you and yours never fretting until the dwarves themselves cease to be.
And what about the other races? You're going to be monopoly. The dwarfess bumped his ribs with her elbow.
Come on now, Mr. Yule, we dwarves are fair. We have plans to spread production all around the lower continent and even into the upper, to make sure things are spread evenly. Also, while we are stopping the stock production for these, we will still be making the Hetzer, just with a few modernized touches. Our engineers report they are still highly effective as ambush vehicles, so we will be pushing them more in that direction.
And the lighter vehicles? Yule asked, and began to scritch at his neck as he mulled over things in his head.
Pumas will be modernized as well, but not by much. Sort of the same for the half-tracks, but we are rolling them into the model we are designating as the CAD 1, making them fully enclosed with a smaller turret up front for a machine gunner. We've seen what the Strikers can do and believe we can do better with the half-track platform.
And I'm sure these are all hiding behind the paywall. Yule replied as he flicked through the pages, looking over the sketches of these upgraded vehicles. He saw one in particular and chuckled. Who showed you the Kettenkrad? The dwarfess blinked as the English word hit her square in the ears.
The kitten... Who?
This, Yule said while tapping his finger on the paper. This is just a beefier kitten. Did you guys come up with this on your own? The dwarfess reached up with a finger and tilted the clipboard back down towards her.
The ferret. We thought it would be a good machine to haul around ammo, artillery pieces, and do work on flight lines. You're saying this already exists?
It did, yeah. We called it the Kettenkrad, Yule said, and he saw the dwarfess start to smile to herself.
Oh, well, look at us go.
She said, glowing with pride, but quickly went back to her business attitude.
Anyway, all that aside.
Yule ran a finger along his eyebrow a few times before shaking his head. Very well, Gremlin can help you out with the rest of it. I assume you want my thumb.
Yes, please.
She said, and patiently waited while Yule pulled out his pocket knife and poked a small hole in his flesh. Once his thumb was well covered in blood, he pressed it down onto the paper where he needed to, leaving a neat thumbprint on the crisp parchment. The dwarfess blew on it softly till it was dry, then tapped the clipboard to her brow in a salute.
Thanks for doing business with us.
Yule murmured as the new tanks began to make their way into the motor pool to the sound of cheers from the troopers around them. Yule sucked on his thumb and growled angrily as someone pushed past him, noting it was Rhodes moving on a dead sprint towards the first Delta Juliet-93.
Dibs! I call dibs! That one is mine!
She roared as she bulldozed her way through the crowd, and not even the poor dwarf engineer that was in the commander hatch could stop her from wrenching open the gunner hatch and wriggling down inside the tank's fighting compartment. Macarat slid past the packed chairs with 4 ice-cold glasses of local mead in her hands, at times having to stand on the tips of her boots in order to get her butt over some of the higher-hanging chairbacks. With patience and artful dodging, she arrived at the table she was sharing with a few other auxiliaries, and they all clapped and mock cheer when she set the glasses down on the tabletop.
Oh, shut up. It's not like your giant ass could get through these chairs, Giorgio.
Macarat said, casting a playfully withering look at the Goliath. Giorgio's chair groaned in agony as he leaned forward and scooped up one of the larger glasses, and he smiled happily.
This is true. That and this chair could not handle me sitting back down in it again.
No handle.
Vitka said sadly as her wing claws attempted to pick up the slate glass of the mead, and she angrily growled in her throat as she slowly shuffled the glass towards her. Normally this would have been relatively easy for harpies, but Himalayans had much longer wing claws than others. Macarat fished around in the cargo pocket of her uniform bottoms as she held up a finger.
Hold on. I thought this would be a problem.
She screwed up her eyes as she continued to fish around, finding what she was after with a triumphant
Aha!
Held aloft in her hand was a wooden loop with 2 handles on either side that could slip onto the glass itself from the bottom, and Vitka leaned forward out of her chair to see it.
Oh, what is little ring?
She asked, and she reached out with a wing claw to pluck it from Macarat's hand. Macarat held it out to her with her thumb and forefinger, knowing just what those Himalaya harpy claws could do.
The humans call it a sippy or something. Here, let me get that for you.
Macarat said, leaning over towards Vitka so she could help get the glass into the double-handled harpy sippy. Another member of the table laughed as she leaned forward to grab one of the other glasses, one of her long valley elf ears wrapped in a bandage and half missing. Private Helena winced as she brought her arm up with the glass, but sighed after taking a sip of the cold mead.
Sippies? Flying dragons made of steel? Magical wands that shoot lead? What do these humans not think of?
Hard to say. Wasn't it that big gruesome fellow who kept you alive after all your stab wounds?
Asked Giorgio, who drank his meat slowly and with measure. Goliaths, while large, were weak to the effects of alcohol and had to pace themselves in order to not end up naked in an alleyway somewhere. Helena nodded, taking a far larger pull from her glass.
Aye, he had to stick his fingers in me to stop some— Oh, grow up, Makarat.
She shouted, picking up a bread crust from her plate and pelting the snorting Makarat in the forehead with it. She glowered at the brim touch before turning back to Giorgio.
He had to reach in and manually pinch something to stop my bleeding. I was only still alive because I was getting constant treatment, and he had someone else feeding me their blood via some kind of tube? It was weird, but it kept me alive.
It was a record amount of stabs. That southern elf got you, what, 20 times?
Makarat asked, taking a sip from her glass.
19. I stabbed her 13 times, and she also lived. It was awkward because I think the medical corps put us side by side in the medical barracks on purpose.
Helena said with a soft laugh, and Vitka raised an eyebrow, glass held firmly in both wing claws via her sippy handles.
They put Helena next to enemy on purpose? Did fights happen often?
Helena shook her head.
No, we were far too tired and injured to really continue our brawl. If anything, she was incredibly lonely and cried a lot. She's in the prison barracks now.
Vitka snorted.
Crying like a baby next to enemy is embarrassing. If Vitka was next to enemy, Vitka would finish job before enemy could think of doing so.
She then raised her sippy-adorned glass of mead to her lips and slurped noisily, and even Giorgio had to look away and cough to hide his laughter. A male Oni Private First Class walked up to the table and pulled out the last remaining seat, setting down his own glass of ale as he did.
How in the mother's name did you get those drinks so quickly, Makarat?
Zaza! You can get a lot of things when you're the personal bodyguard of Alavara, jewel of King Yule.
Makarat said airily, leaning back in her chair with a cocky smile.
You told them the drinks were for Alvara and Mr. Yule, then?
Asked Saza, and he pulled himself in towards the table, scooting the chair with short, jerky movements. Makarat raised her glass.
Naturally.
All fun and games until you push your luck too much and Yule bounces your head off a door or something.
Muttered Saza as he crossed his boots.
Or throw you out a window.
Chimed in Giorgio with a friendly smile. Helena pulled her glass away with a snort.
Or stuffs you into a locker box.
A rip face of Makarat!
Vitka cried out cheerfully and set down her glass in order to mock ripping off her own face with her wing talons. Makarat visibly bristled and wrinkled her nose, holding out her hand to silence their sniggering.
All right. Thank you very much, Peanut Gallery. I'll be sure to keep my hijinks under Yule's radar.
The table laughed together, except for Giorgio, who was looking up in thought as he slowly drank from his glass. He smacked his lips once, then looked over to Makarat with a raised brow.
Peanut Gallery?
I don't know. I heard Yule say it in their mother language. I think they used to have museums to tree nuts or something.
Makarat said with a wave of her hand. Behind her, the stage for the night's entertainment was being made ready, which was why there were so many people packed inside the now enlarged ruffled magpie.
However, to be honest, I jokingly called him King Yule once to see what would happen, and he held me outside a window by my feet until I had almost peed myself out of fear.
Sounds like Yule.
Said Saza, and everyone else nodded in agreement that it fit his modus operandi.
Speaking of Yule,
Helena said, watching the stage getting set up with an interested eye.
how is he doing? You're around Alavera a lot of the time, so you see him more than anyone else.
Makarat bobbed her head from side to side as she swallowed a mouthful of her mead.
He's doing okay, I guess. Alavara keeps him busy, as do the rest of the NCOs. He had a tiff with a few of his humans because they set up shop in one of the brothels in town.
Vitka said, swallowing awkwardly as she tried to get her words out.
Makarat speak of cheeky pinches. Vitka have room in attic next door. Humans always hanging out at cheeky pinches.
Giorgio parted his mouth slightly as he thought, then leaned forward, setting his glass down on the table.
Isn't Cheeky Pinches the one full of women who cut their hair short and work out a lot? I remember it because we use their gymnasium when the one in the barracks is full.
That's the one.
Makarat said while pointing a finger at Giorgio, and he squinted at her while shooting her a single finger gun in response.
His Veil Riders were going under his orders and not only taking partners from Cheeky Pinches, but a few of them even got married.
Saza coughed into his glass and spluttered.
Married? They're all flesh workers.
Helena and Vitka giggled, but Makarat just held up a hand.
Hey, the humans don't seem to care one way or another. The ones who got married the fastest were the ones that came from that Fey woman, Rommel. They seem to want to get back into the swing of having families again.
I think it's kind of sweet.
Helena said, and she leaned forward onto the table, resting on an elbow with her chin perched on her hand.
I don't know if a human would be interested in me with half my ear missing. I was working on the one they call Grouch, and another human named Gabriel. Gabriel has been very receptive, but Grouch?
Oh, I know all about that one.
Saza mused, grinning from ear to ear.
He's after far larger game.
Helena squinted at him, but blanched when Saza held out both of his hands in a wide span of measurement and mouthed centaurs at her. She looked at Makarat, who was chuckling into her glass, then to Giorgio, who had his eyes closed, pretending he didn't see what Saza just did. Helena smiled cautiously.
No. There's no way he's putting a centaur over me, right?
Man likes them big.
Saza said in a mock professional tone, then immediately broke into full-bellied laughter when Helena visibly erupted in outrage.
There's no way. No. There's no way a centaur is the reason he's not catching my advances.
Helena stated and leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Saza patted down his uniform top as he worked the giggles out of his system.
Aw, don't feel too bad. If you strike out with them, you can probably pick up Oliver. He's the blue-eyed one that's been telling me about his rough relationships back on their home plane.
Oh, you mean the one with the kind of wavy hair and is really nice to animals? He is handsome.
Helena said, leaning forward again and resting her chin on the rim of her glass. Giorgio went to inject something else into the discussion, but one of the entertainers that had walked out on stage caught his eye and he squinted.
What is that?
Everyone else at the table turned and looked at the stage, and a valley elf with red clay-colored hair running down her back in long braids was holding some kind of large wheeled instrument.
I've never seen anything like that before.
Saza said, and Helena nodded in agreement.
Looks like something an engineer or a bread maker would use. It even has a hand crank. What's that about?
Makarat arched up out of her chair to get a better look, leaning back and forth to see past the many heads.
Looks like a lot of the humans are stacking up along the stage. Oh, even Yule and Elvira are here. Look!
Makarat pointed to a side table where Yule and Olivara were sitting, and at the same table were a number of NCOs, one of which was Domino, who of course had Savarus snugly sitting to his side. Makarat openly laughed as Yule and Savarus both traded angry middle fingers at each other until Olivara pinched Yule's tricep to make him stop. She looked over at her table and nodded her head towards the pair.
Yeah, he's doing okay.
The red clay-haired valley elf on the stage held up her hand as a signal that she was ready to play, and everyone quieted down like a hush of a wave towards the back of the ruffled magpie. She smiled, then placed her hand down on the instrument and began to speak. However, the table was far enough back that most of those at the table had trouble hearing, and they all looked at Vitka.
Can your ears pick her up?
Asked Giorgio, and Vitka cocked her head.
Vitka can hear. Elf say her name Atrix Aorix.
Helena tapped her nail on the side of her glass.
She's a northerner then. Interesting. Must have traveled hundreds of miles to be here.
Vitka, however, was still listening with her keen ears.
Atrix say she learned songs of humans, and humans give her special instrument. Hurdy-gurdy? Hurdy-gurdy? Hurdy-gurdy.
That's a human instrument? Looks complicated as all can imagine. Why not just learn the songs on Affinitary lands?
Asked Makarat, and Saza shrugged.
Don't know.
Vitka held up a wing-claw digit.
Atrix sing Machli Machlone first.
Sounds like a cheerful song,
said Giorgio, but the tune that poured out of that instrument caught everyone but the humans off guard. As Atrix Aorix turned the handle of the hurdy-gurdy, the drone of its back note flooded the room like a wave, and not a single ear missed its burden. Then with ease and grace she began to work the keys, pulling notes out of the background and working them into a melody that could make the soul itself quake and tremble. Makarat's fingers began to twitch slightly on her glass, and she looked around wide-eyed to Saza, who was leaning forward, mouth slightly parted.
What? Is this a spell? What is happening? I can feel it in my bones. Ugh.
Her words were cut away by the clear and ringing voice of Atrix, who began to sing with closed eyes. Her accent of the northern cities and way of speaking added another level of depth to the song as she sang, her lilt almost dancing among the words.
In Dublin's fair city, where the girls are so pretty, I first set my eyes on sweet Molly Malone, as she wheeled her wheelbarrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
She was then joined by every human in the crowd, who all began to sing with her in the chorus. Many in the same room as them flinched as the words were felt deep in their minds, and they all sat stock still. The volume grew as the humans joined in and began to yell out the refrain, stomping their boots so hard against the wooden floorboards they shook and trembled.
Alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
What is this?
Helena asked quietly, and even the stalwart Vitka was fluffed from head to toe in alarm. It wasn't something they could see, but something they could feel. Something was happening in the room as the humans sang along with Atrix, and they felt something slowly curl within their chests.
I was told the humans had no magic, but this is human magic.
Giorgio murmured quietly, and he was watching Atrix closely.
These are sad words, but they sing them so happily. Do you feel it?
The floorboard shook harder again as the humans rested their arms upon each other, or wrapped them around the necks of their friends, and still louder they sang, holding up their glasses to the light as they stomped.
Alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
Those behind the humans and around them could not explain why they felt like they did, but the more the humans sang, the more they felt intertwined with them, as if they were a dire wolf being drawn in by the howl of the pack. The longer the humans sang, the more they felt attached to these strange people who came over the veil. The feeling dulled down to a numb buzz in their chests when the song ended, and many breathed out harshly, realizing they'd been barely breathing the entire time. Makarat heaved in a breath and rubbed at her chest, small tears seeking down her cheeks as she looked around.
What in the hell was that?
Neither she nor her table had much time to recover before Atrix spun their instrument back into life, and everyone braced themselves for what was to come as the Valley Elf began to sing again in her clear, clean voice.
I am a poor wayfaring rider. I'm traveling through this fair world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, door, nor danger in that bright land to which I go. I'm going there to see my dreams. I'm going there, no regrets to bear. I'm only going over Veilite, and for we they must prepare.
The table watched as none of the humans joined in with the song now, but stared on at Atrix as she sang, and even they began to wrinkle their nose as they fought their own emotions. Others looked down, or hung their head as they now clung to the humans around them. Makarat felt her heart pang as she watched them, something she thought the previous song had caused, and looked over to Helena to see she was doing the same, one hand curled up near her chest in a worried posture. Without warning, the humans lifted their heads and joined Atrix in this new refrain, and an invisible pulse radiated out from them like waves rushing in towards shore. It washed over the auxiliaries behind them, and despite not knowing the words, felt them enter their head as if asking them to join in with the humans.
I'm going home to see my brothers and all my comrades who've gone on. I'm only going over Vale Light. I'm only going onward home. We know dark clouds will gather round us. We know the cost is dark and steep, but our dreams lie just before us, where riders fall and ever sleep.
Atrix continued to sing through the rest of the song, and none of the auxiliaries in the room could understand why the humans would like such sad songs, or why they felt like they did when the humans heard the music. For a solid half of an hour, Atrix sang more human songs, and by the end of her set, there was not an auxiliary in the inn that would not die for these people who came so far from home, yet were so willing to sacrifice themselves to protect this alien world. It was almost like a new day had turned over when a more usual local set came onto the stage and began to play more regional and cheery songs. Atrix sat amongst the humans who shook her hand and thanked her for the songs, as well as some who clapped her on the shoulder and said they were buying her drinks. The humans changed moods as rapidly as they did rifle magazines when a familiar dancing brim-touched came up onto the stage after the locals, bearing another human instrument, the electric guitar. This set of human songs was a far cry from Atrix's, and Belle de Rey the Brazen had also copied the same clothing style of the musicians who played such an instrument, flavorful tattoos included. It could be said that cut-up blue jeans and tank tops that came up just below the rib cage hadn't quite taken off on the Vale world, and Chicks was more than happy to point out those clothes were actually hers amongst the whistling, having sold them to Belle Del Rey. Belle Del Rey energized the room in the exact opposite polarity of Atrix, and within the first pass of Hail to the King, everyone was nodding their heads and grinning along with the beat of the drummer and the strumming of Belle Del Rey. These songs and the way they were played got the blood of the auxiliaries pumping in the same way combat did, a feeling they all found odd, but it did keep their mood elevated. Belle Del Rey playfully bowed to the crowd after her almost hour-long set, and gave them the rock and roll salute before happily strutting off the stage. The last group of the night slowly made their way onto the stage, a band that many of the crowd did not recognize. After a fresh round of drinks brought to the table by Helena, they all sat back and watched how the new group did not even set up at all, but instead brought out strange reed-like instruments from low-slung satchels at their sides.
What are they going to do, call up worms from the ground?
Asked Makarat, and Saza laughed.
That or try and whistle the fairies to sleep. Seems an odd choice for this kind of place.
Makarat looked on as the band began to play a single note, and cocked her head a twitch at the sound. She began to blink heavily, and she set down her new mead.
Whoa, this stuff suddenly hit me pretty hard.
This, however, did not feel right to Makarat, or to anyone else it seemed, as many in the room were shaking their heads or looking around in confusion. A noise startled Makarat, and she recognized it to be yelling. She looked around drowsily and saw that the noise was actually First Sergeant Erinda Caine bellowing out in rage while raising her rifle, and the move seemed out of place to Makarat. Helena groaned, and everyone's ears were suddenly full of the rest of the players on stage blowing into their instruments. Even the humans came under the harsh effect from the notes, many of whom were scrambling for weapons with clumsy limbs. Makarat could barely make out the screaming of Erinda Caine and the sound of her rifle firing before her head hit the table, and something above hushed over her head and thudded into someone in the background, the loud shuddering of a body hitting a table then the floor barely audible. Her ears began to ring, her vision began to fade, until finally she neither felt nor heard anything at all. Makarat awoke with a snort and a jerk, her head whipping backwards as she rallied up onto her feet clumsily. She stumbled over someone who had fallen over in their chair as they too woke up, and after a few more breaths the room became alive once again. Humans were helping up Atrix and Belle Del Rey while looking around, weapons raised. Auxiliaries were coming around with their pistols or knives held in their hands, while someone else called out for a medic. Makarat looked over and saw that Erinda Caine was breathing harshly, a crossbow bolt stuck in her chest just above the heart, and 3 members of the medical corps were rushing over, medical bags in hand. There was one noise, however, that hit Makarat hard in the chest, and that was the worried, shaken voice of Olivara.
Where is Yule? Does anyone see Yule?
Another voice rang out, and it was Wolf, who was unsteadily pulling a figure off the ground.
This isn't one of ours. Andy's been stabbed to death.
Makarat made her way over to Olivara and inhaled sharply at the scene around the table where Yule once sat. Blood was smeared and sprayed everywhere, as if someone had been slit across the throat or neck. Every so often she spied the faint glitter of gold amongst the blood, but it was faint, and only if the light caught it right. 5 bodies littered the ground, all in matching Veilside garb. These bodies had been stabbed, slashed, or simply crushed to death, and they slowly trailed towards the main door of the inn. Along the way, multiple chairs had been broken, half a table had been shattered away, and lots of broken glasses had blood on them, as if they'd been broken off or into a living person. Olivara ran over with unsure legs and slammed into Makarat, who helped steady her and keep her standing, and she looked up into the brim-touched eyes.
I can't feel him, Makarat. I can't feel him!
Makarat could see the near terror the thought brought to Olivara's mind, and she wrapped the crimson-haired valley elf in an arm, looking around in a daze. After action report. Coco hummed happily from inside the office of his newly built hangar, quietly stirring a spoon into a fresh cup of tea. It had been a busy week as far as Zerg Company was concerned, with the building of new hangars and the destruction of multiple forward operating bases by Southern Elf infiltrators. Despite the losses, recruitment was still plowing ahead at breakneck pace. More races had become available as well, as word had traveled north and west along the shorelines and rivers. Things were looking up despite the downsides, and Coco was looking forward to going out into the field once more. After all, it felt weird wearing the same uniform he and Yule had agreed on, and never even getting the chance to really get them dirty. He remembered there was a swinging door type assault about to launch in a week, and he made a mental note to attach himself to it. That Yule keeps having all the fun while I'm over here playing City Builder, Coco muttered, then brought the tea to his lips for a test slurp. He grimaced as it needed more sweetener, and he poured a little more honey into it from a nearby pot. Around him, other humans and auxiliaries went about their duties, but one Valley Elf in particular was sitting next to Coco's desk, and she sipped at her own mug of tea. Imra Ira Alora swished the tea around her mouth a few times before swallowing, then looked up at Coco as he turned around.
I would hardly say Yule is having fun. From how the reports have read, the human was fighting for his life in Tallweed.
Yes, well, if you ask me, he's lucky. There's no kind of living like staring death in the face. Coco mused, and stepped back over to his chair, pulling it out and groaning out as he sat down. Back to our discussion about these dwarven creatures.
The gremlins.
Imra said, and Coco nodding, gesturing for her to continue with his mug of tea.
They are a curious creature that only listen to the dwarves, but I would not call them friendly. They are ethereal in nature, much like a ghost, and thought to be lost dwarven souls who come up through the deep caves and cracks in the earth. I do not share this same thought, and truth be told, not many of the dwarves do either.
Coco sipped his mug, then smacked his lips. So, what are they then?
No different than a fairy, if you ask me. Curiously, they love iron, steel, metals, and find mischief if they're not placated. Dwarfs have had hammers pop off hooks and slam into toes, sections of mail rings coming undone and ruining hours of hard work, or even having their bellows suddenly develop holes.
Imra said with a smile, and Coco couldn't help but smile along with her. So they're just another fantasy creature then, yet the dwarves trust them. Imra nodded her head to the side softly.
Trust them enough, as long as you placate them with offerings of ale and other spirits, in addition to praise. They can become stalwart allies, quick-thinking, naturally gifted at arithmetic, even though we know not how, and able to operate machinery all on their own. Some have even imbued themselves into weapons, causing them to alight with fire, among other such things.
Ale and whiskey, As long as the little spirit buggers stay tanked, we can trust them to do their duties? Coco asked. Imra nodded again, paused, then raised her shoulders.
Well, I would hope so, anyway. They're already being implemented into the new armor rolling out of Alifanor and Drazdegrag.
And into our machines coming out of Regnessen. The gremlins are going to be watching over altitude and weapon systems, Coco added, and he leaned back in his chair. Not to mention there have been stories of something flying out of the Karas Vale and helping you, something that you lot should have never been able to get your hands on.
The Vale works in its own way, in its own mind. Even more so now that it has gone rogue. I have an inkling the Fae are trying to corral it, but it breaks free, only to be wrangled again. I wonder what it's doing.
Imra said idly and tapped her nail on the rim of her tea mug. Coco hummed a single laugh in his chest, then set down his mug. Yes, well, let's hope it's on our side in the end. Imra took another sip of her tea as Coco leaned his neck to the side, a light popping emanating from his spine, and he snapped it back up when the front door to the hangar office crashed open. A messenger harpy, looking windswept, ragged, and bleeding from the nostrils, stalked in through the door, talon nails clicking along the wooden floor as he stalked towards the first person he could see. "Ho, you look like shit, Private! David, get this poor man some water, he looks like he needs it," Coco shouted, and gestured towards another human who was cleaning his grenade launcher.
No time for water.
The harpy sputtered, blood oozing down his nose, and he clicked along the wooden floor towards Coco, reaching into his satchel as he went. He pulled out a letter and thrust it towards Coco, his wing claws shaking in exhaustion. Coco lifted his brows, then took the letter. All very well, but... and he's passed out. As the harpy was leaning to the side, clearly gone from the mine, Coco reached out with a foot and caught him, arresting his fall with tea in one hand and letter in the other. Others nearby scrambled over to pick the harpy up. Take him to a guest quarters and have a medic check him over. Never seen a harpy in that state before, Coco ordered, then set down his tea to deftly open the letter. He got through the first 3 lines before turning and picking up a base landline phone, and soon an orderly was echoing out Coco's order through the base. Like ants sprinting back towards their nest, humans and high-ranking NCOs rushed towards the hangar office, crowding in as Coco finished the letter. Imra looked up at Coco and raised her eyebrows, having been reading the letter in reverse as the sun backlit the parchment.
Well, that's going to make things very interesting.
A blonde-haired human drill sergeant took off her brown campaign hat as she stormed in, the badge showing she was the heavy weapons and gunnery instructor.
Coco, what's going on?
Coco folded the letter up into a long square as he looked over at her, mouth forming a grim line. They got him, Ava. Drill Sergeant Ava leaned her head forward.
You don't mean...
Yes, Coco answered, and he looked towards the rest of the human NCOs. Somehow they got him during a music performance and took Yule, they assume alive, and he killed 5 of his abductors on the way out. Wolf says the locals figured out it was some kind of magical special forces gang or something. They knocked them all out with some kind of pollen hidden in their instruments, but Yule wasn't affected for some reason. Imra held up a finger as she set down her tea mug.
Huh? Not special forces per se. These are forcefully retired or rogue warcasters that become mercenaries. I'd wager the Fae or King Radagem paid the fee in order to get you.
Why would they take him alive?
Asked Driggs, who was still holding a pot of pepper plants in his hand, having run all the way over from the greenhouse.
They got raffle stomped over there at Tall Wheat and are on the back foot.
Coco breathed out his nose as he tapped his boot on the ground, moving his lower jaw as if he was chewing on his words. Finally he spoke up and looked around the room. They may have taken him alive as a ransom, as a pawn piece to make a 2nd Division leave, or for any number of things, really. We're too far away to do anything ourselves, but we can still help in our own way. Yule sold plans to the dwarves, and while I don't want to, we have to accelerate our aviation program here.
That's fucking impossible, Coco.
Remarked another human from his desk, and he motioned towards the hangars.
We don't have any fuel stockpiled in the other bases, and only 3 working birds that still haven't even hit their seasoning miles. Production hasn't spun up to full speed yet, and any losses will be catastrophic.
I know, which is why we're going to start ferrying fuel right now, on the double, even if it's just 1 liter at a time. Get Doomsday ready to start running fuel and grab me any strongbone harpies. We're getting this done. Coco hammered out with authority, then turned to a human wearing aviator sunglasses. Jones, do you still have direct contact with Odesca?
I do. He can be encouraged to increase their factories to full staff despite his reluctance. I suspect with enough grease he can get them pumping out frames so that any losses can be quickly recovered. He's still being a bit of an asshole with the tubing and won't share it with the dwarves. Says it's insurance.
Coco shrugged. That is not important. Yule's 2nd Division is going to need all the help it can get, and I want a bird there in operating order within 3 days. Everyone else, I want you on notice. We're pushing out on our offensive 3 days from now as well. We're pushing straight down and out. We're going to give Yule room to breathe. Objections? No one else in the room spoke, and Coco nodded. Good.
If I may, Coco,
said Imra, and she slowly came up onto her feet, setting down her mug.
I may know of a better way to get both your fuel and your equipment to Kara's Vale. A way that will save you days of time and travel.
How many days? Asked Coco, and he held out a hand to quiet Jones, who had made to speak up.
I can get you there instantly,
Imra said matter-of-factly, and a foxish smirk was beginning to form along her lips. Coco noted the smirk, and his mouth formed into a short line. Sounds costly.
I am a friend of Yule, and only want what is fair, my dear Coco,
Imra said, and she turned, now standing square to Coco, her hands clasped politely behind her back. Coco crossed his arms across his chest and leaned forward, speaking in a quiet but stern voice. And what would that be? Imra leaned in as well, and brought her soft lips just near his ear, brushing her cheek against his ever so gently.
I want a favor.
And that is the end of Book 2, The Veil Riders 2 Electric Boogaloo. If you like the story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbeardia, and please share the channel and the book with your friends and those who you think may enjoy it, as well as direct them towards the channel in our Discord. If you really like the story and the books, please donate to the Ko-fi link down below. Give whatever you can. It helps pay for the VAs, the voice actors, the people who breathe more life than my stupid country ass into this fucking book series. But yeah, after this, we're going to finish up the Emily Braun series, and then art, hopefully a lot of art, and then get art into the 1st and 2nd books. 2nd book get published, hopefully. Hopefully Emily Braun's book get published, if not by a regular publisher, a self-publisher. And yeah, so while recording the first part, on the next day while I'm recording now, I learned that Redcon 1, I'm now like a tier 3 operator, and I get a, we call it a commission. I get a commission from Redcon 1 purchases. So if you want to support the channel in a different way, go buy that protein powder, go buy that pre-workout, go get swole, go be the man your tomboy girlfriend wants you to be, and head on by Redcon 1. Also, I'm going to try and do a stream with all the VAs so y'all can meet each other and talk about stuff. That should be fun. Hopefully, there's a lot of time zones to get right, so we're going to work on that. But anyway, we finished book 2. We got there. And I have so many more stories to come. You have no idea. I'm going to tell you the name of the next story, and it's simply Section 222. Y'all should enjoy that one. Yeah, it's a bit more gritty than depth with a simple squad dynamic. I think y'all can enjoy it. But anyway. Whew, that was Eliza, that was Fire, that was Lyque the Dragon Queen, that was Vin, that was Aristic, that was Icicle, that was our Dusty, our Beldam, and this is Garbeardia.
Hey, no, there's no way he's putting a centaur over me, right? Ain't no way.
Fuckett says he knows you have something he wants. Like a vocabulary and the ability to read.
Elvira, my goodness. Why is her name so fucking hard to say in this accent?
Isn't cheeky bitch... cheeky bitches. Wow, that is not the line. Okay. Oh, thank Christ for the delete button.
Sazza,
You can get a lot of things done when you are... You can get a lot of things. Where is the done coming from? I am making up words!
At times having to stand on the tips of her boots in order to get her butt over some of the higher hanging
Isn't Chinky wow. You know what, God, bro? Go fuck yourself.
Double-handed harpy sippy, double-handed harpy sippy, double-handed harpy sippy, double-handed harpy sippy.
And he held me outside a window by my feet until I had almost peed myself out of fear. Couldn't say it was really a pleasant experience. Slightly arousing, though. Where did that come from?
I hate this line. Cheeky pinches. Cheeky pinches. I have officially lost my mind.
Sounds like a cheerful song. Sounds like a cheerful song. It's a very cheerful song.
That's the one. His field riders were going under his orders, not only taking... If you think Australian accents are hard, New Zealand accents are much harder, and I don't even think I'm doing it right.